Thanks, Alex. So this next session is really a chance to provide a very brief update in two areas. The first around the progress we're making in terms of linking to primary care records for the cohort. And the second area around where we are with making available the primary care data that we do have today and incorporating it into the resource for use by researchers. So just to start, getting access to primary care records is critically important for a prospective cohort study such as Biobank. If you look at the outcomes that will be of most interest to researchers using the Biobank resource, many of these will only have kind of codes that are found within primary care data. And if you look at the table, for example, diseases such as dementia, which are predominantly handled within a primary care setting, will be found within primary care data more than secondary care. And you'll see just by the differences in ascertainment rates of what we'd expect by adding primary care to the resource. So this really is a matter of huge focus for Biobank at the moment in terms of how we complete the primary care linkage. So there are a few challenges with getting access to primary care that makes this a little bit more difficult. Fortunately, on a positive note, we do have participants that are each registered with a GP practice in the NHS, and as part of participating in the resource, they gave their consent for us to be able to link to their records. But in the primary care setting, which is quite different to the likes of secondary care, there is no single kind of national source that we can go to get access to those data. So whereas we can engage with the likes of NHS Digital in England and ISD in Scotland for the likes of hospital records, there isn't that flow of primary care to those national bodies. So this has led us over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly in England, to take a different approach, and which has been to work with the main GP primary care system software suppliers in the UK as a way of getting access to these data. And we've had terrific support from TPP, from Vision, what was In Practice Systems via Apollo, and with EMIS in helping us to do this. So in terms of what primary care linkage we have achieved so far, so it's probably worth reflecting back in terms of the progress we have made over the years and where we started in 2012 with getting access to primary care data in Wales via the Sale Gateway in Swansea. And we have pretty good coverage. It's almost complete coverage, about 95% for Welsh Biobank participants. In Scotland, we've taken a slightly different approach. Here we've been working with a company called Albasoft, who have software installed in a large number of GP practices across Scotland, which gives us access to primary care records through that mechanism. Again, we have pretty good coverage rates, about 75% and rising. It's a different story in England, and this is where we have really been focusing over the last couple of years working with the primary care providers. And in 2016, we worked very closely with TPP, and we were able to get access to a little over 160,000 participant records. And then a year later, working with Vision via Apollo to get access to around another 19,000 or so. So at the moment, we have around almost half of the resource where we have primary care record linkage in place. So you may be asking, why is it taking so long? And actually, that model of working with the GP system suppliers worked really well. We were proceeding on what we refer to as kind of an opt-out basis, where we would write to all of the GP practices, explain what Biobank is about and the scope of the resource, explain what we were looking to get access to in terms of coded data and the basis of our kind of legal consent to be able to do that. And that model worked really well. And in terms of engaging with those TPP practices, out of a little over 2,500 practices, there was only one that chose not to participate. That opt-out process was endorsed by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK and also endorsed by the Royal College of General Practitioners, the RCGP. But there were concerns raised from other quarters around the process that we'd adopted, and particularly from the RCGP and BMA Joint IT Committee, that led to a pause in these extracts taking place whilst we worked through what those concerns were and how we might address them. So we have been engaging quite extensively with pretty much every stakeholder group you can imagine within the UK setting. So the ICO, NHS England, NHS Digital, RCGP, and again the RCGP BMA Joint IT Committee. And we've had tremendous support from each of those groups, from the likes of Sarah Wilkinson from NHS Digital, who are doing a fabulous job to help us try and get through this approach. We've now got a revised method, which is based on practices opting in, and that's been agreed and has now been endorsed by all of those groups. I think we are optimistic that we'll have success, but it will require getting the attention of GPs in what is already quite a pressured primary care environment to be able to get their attention to opt into this extract to allow these data to flow for Biobank participants. In terms of how we are trying to maximise that success of that engagement, we do have statements of support from many different individuals. So one here, for example, from Professor Helen Stokes-Lampard, who's the chair of the RCGP, who again has been terrifically supportive of this process. And we have similar statements of support from other groups, such as Sarah Wilkinson, NHS Digital, and Professor Dame Sally Davis, CMO for England. And we're hoping that this will help build confidence with the GPs and get their attention. So, as I mentioned, this revised approach does have endorsement from all of those key parties, and particularly the RCGP, BMA Joint IT Committee. And we have thought about how we reduce any administrative burden that's placed on GP practices to make it really easy for them to participate. And all they need to do is simply set a flag within the primary care system for those data to flow. So where are we now? We're about to start a pilot. We're going to be writing once more to each of the practices across England. Also, we'll be doing the same in Scotland and elsewhere, but the focus at the moment is about England, to seek their opt-in to this data extract for consented participants. The pilot mailing will start in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and that will go out to an initial mailing of around 600 practices to get feedback and any changes we may wish to accommodate ahead of a main mailing which will start to the remaining around 6,000 practices across England later this year in September timescales. We do hope with the level of support and things we put into this, we're providing a lot of additional information in terms of frequently asked questions, thoughts in terms of how practices can reduce any of the kind of burden from an information governance perspective, and we're hoping that we'll have a strong chance of success, and that in Q4 this year, provided we have a substantial enough number of practices that have opted in, that we will then do a further extract across England, and then we will look to repeat that on an annual basis going forward. And hopefully we can come back this time next year to report on that success. So that's where we are in terms of getting access to those data. For the data that we have in Biobank today, so as mentioned, we have about half the cohort covered, so around 234,000 participants, and some teaser tasters. That kind of links to somewhere in the region of 120 million clinical events and over 50 million prescription items. This data set will be made available as an interim release in the very near future. It only contains coded data, so there's no unstructured data being provided, but it's coded data that we think will be of most importance for epidemiology purposes for the resource. And it's focused on clinical events, prescriptions, lab results, immunisation records and similar. Now, for those who aren't close to the way that primary care works in the UK, there are a number of different coding standards in use today, so different variants of READ, which is a coding standard used in the UK, so version 2 and version 3. There is a general move within the NHS to move to a common coding classification based on SNOMED CT, and we'll see that, I think, emerge with more maturity in the coming months and years. But for now, we'll be making available those data in their native coding standards, within the resource with only a limited amount of data curation applied. So as I mentioned, this will be an interim release. As Robin said earlier, we'll be looking to provide refreshers of these linked data on an annual basis from 2020 and going forward. The way that will be providing access to the primary care records will be through the existing online portal which researchers can use for access to the hospital episode statistics data. But our intent, just recognizing that this is quite a complex administrative data set and again requires some understanding of different coding classifications. Our intent is to provide a number of algorithmically derived kind of outcome fields that we can incorporate in the resource. And again, I won't steal Kathy's thunder, and she'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And in terms of timelines, the anticipation is that we'll be making the record level data available in early Q3 this year. So this is our main focus right now, building on the showcase release we had back in March for the exome and biomarker data. This next version will be focused on the primary care data. If we can, we'll be looking to include these derived outcome fields either coincident with that release or very shortly thereafter. So please keep an eye out for emails from the Access team in terms of the future showcase releases, and more information will be forthcoming. And with that, just want to say thank you particularly to those supporting groups who've been working very closely with us across NHS England, NHS Digital, and particularly the RCGP, and the very helpful support we've had from the RCGP, BMA, Joint IT Committee. So thank you.